David had dreamed about owning a cabin in the woods for as long as he could remember. After working at the same accounting firm for nearly 2 decades, he finally had enough saved up to make it happen. The cabin wasn't anything fancy. It was a small wooden structure sitting on 3 acres of land in northern Michigan, surrounded by tall pine trees and maple groves. A little creek ran along the eastern edge of the property, and the sound of running water was the most peaceful thing David had ever heard. The day he signed the papers at the real estate office, his hands were actually shaking. This was it, his own piece of the wilderness. No neighbors breathing down his neck, no city noise, just trees, birds, and fresh air. His wife Linda was just as excited as he was. She'd already started planning which curtains would go in the windows and where they'd plant a small vegetable garden come spring. The cabin needed work. Anyone could see that. The previous owner had been an elderly man who'd let things slide in his final years. The roof had a few soft spots, the porch steps wobbled when you walked on them, and the kitchen hadn't been updated since the 80s. But David didn't mind. He was handy enough with tools, and fixing the place up would be part of the adventure. What made David especially careful from day one was his nature. He kept everything organized. Every receipt went into a folder. Every permit he applied for got filed away. He even kept a small notebook where he logged the work he did each weekend. His co-workers used to joke that he could probably account for every paperclip in the office. That attention to detail was just who he was. The first few weeks were perfect. David spent his Saturdays replacing rotted boards on the deck and patching up the roof. Linda worked on the inside, scrubbing years of dust and grime from the windows until they sparkled. They met a few neighbors at the small general store in town. Everyone seemed friendly enough. The family on the neighboring property, the Crawfords, owned about 40 acres of land that connected to David's eastern border. Tom Crawford and his 2 grown sons ran a small logging operation. They seemed like typical rural folks, flannel shirts, work boots, and not much for small talk. But then things started to feel off. David first noticed it about 3 months in. He'd driven up on a Friday evening, planning to spend the weekend staining the new deck boards. As he pulled down the gravel driveway, he saw fresh tire tracks cutting right across his property. They weren't from his truck. These were wider, deeper ATV tracks. He followed them on foot and found they led from the direction of the Crawford property, across his land, and down toward the creek. Someone had been joyriding through his woods. David felt his stomach tighten. He'd posted his property boundaries when he bought the place. The survey markers were clear. This was definitely his land. The next weekend he found more evidence. New trails had been cut through the underbrush. There were boot prints in the soft earth near the creek. Someone had even built a small fire ring using rocks from his property. Empty beer cans lay scattered in the leaves nearby. David decided to handle it the neighborly way. He didn't want to start off on the wrong foot with the locals. That next Saturday he drove over to the Crawford property and knocked on the door of their farmhouse. Tom Crawford answered, a thick man in his 50s with arms like tree trunks and a weathered face that rarely smiled. David kept it polite. He explained that he'd noticed ATV tracks on his land and wondered if maybe someone had gotten confused about the property lines. Tom stared at him for a long moment, then spit tobacco juice into the dirt beside the porch. These woods been open to everyone for 30 years, Tom said flatly. My daddy used to hunt through there. His daddy before him. David felt his face flush. I understand, but it's my property now. I own it. I'd just appreciate it if people asked before crossing through. Tom's eyes narrowed. You one of those city types who comes up here thinking you can change how things work? I'm not trying to change anything, David said, trying to keep his voice steady. I'm just asking for respect for my property rights. Tom didn't respond. He just turned and went back inside, letting the screen door slam behind him. David stood there for a moment, feeling dismissed and frustrated. He walked back to his truck, wondering if he'd just made things worse. He had. Over the next few weeks, the trespassing didn't stop. It got worse. David would find fresh ATV tracks every single weekend. Someone cut down 3 of his trees. Not for any good reason, just hacked them down and left them lying there. When David put up new private property signs along the trail, they were torn down within days. One had been riddled with bullet holes. Linda started to worry. Maybe we should just let it go, she said one evening as they sat on the porch. Is it really worth the stress? David understood her concern, but something inside him refused to back down. He'd worked too hard for this place. He'd saved for years. This was his land, bought and paid for. Why should he have to give it up? Just because some locals thought they had a right to do whatever they wanted. But he also felt increasingly alone in this fight. When he went to the general store, conversations would stop when he walked in. People who'd been friendly before now barely nodded in his direction. The woman at the cash register, who used to chat about the weather, now just rang up his purchases in silence. David tried calling the sheriff's office to report the trespassing. A deputy came out, a young guy who looked barely old enough to shave. He took down David's information, nodded along as David showed him the tire tracks and the cut trees. Then the deputy mentioned almost casually that he was Tom Crawford's nephew. David's heart sank. The deputy filed the report, but David never heard anything back. The harassment escalated. Late one night, David and Linda were jerked awake by the roar of ATV engines right outside the cabin. It was past midnight. The engines revved deliberately, circling the cabin twice before racing off into the darkness. Linda grabbed David's arm, her fingers digging in hard. Neither of them slept the rest of that night. 2 weeks later, David's mailbox was knocked over. He set it back up. 3 days after that, it was knocked down again, this time completely destroyed. He had to buy a new one. Then came the morning he found spray paint on his storage shed. Someone had written "Go home" in large dripping letters across the wooden door. David stood there staring at it, his hands balled into fists. This wasn't just casual trespassing anymore. This was targeted. Someone was trying to drive him away. He took photos of everything. The spray paint, the tire tracks, the cut trees. He started a new folder, this one labeled Incidents. His organizational habits, the ones his coworkers joked about, were now serving a purpose. Every single thing that happened, he documented it. Date, time, what he found, photos from multiple angles. Linda found him one Saturday sitting at the kitchen table surrounded by papers and photographs, his jaw tight with anger and determination. "What are you thinking?" she asked quietly. David looked up at her. "I'm thinking they're trying to bully us off our own land. They think if they make it miserable enough, we'll give up and sell." "And?" Linda asked. "And I'm not giving them that satisfaction," David said. "This is our property. We have every legal right to be here. If they want a fight, they're going to get one. But it's going to be a legal fight by the book, the right way." Linda studied her husband's face, seeing something there she recognized. It was the same determination he'd shown when he'd worked his way through college while working 2 jobs. The same stubborn refusal to quit that had gotten him through every challenge in his life. She nodded slowly. "Okay," she said, "then we fight. But we do it smart." David reached across the table and squeezed her hand. He didn't know exactly how he was going to win this battle yet, but he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. This was his land, and he'd be damned if some bullies were going to take it from him. The real trouble started on a warm Saturday afternoon in late spring. David had driven up to the cabin alone. Linda had stayed home to visit her sister, so it was just him in the quiet woods. He'd been working on replacing some rotten floorboards on the back porch when he heard the distinctive growl of ATV engines getting closer. 3 four-wheelers burst through the tree line onto his property. David straightened up, hammer still in his hand, and watched as they tore across his land, kicking up dirt and debris. They weren't just passing through. They were doing donuts, deliberately churning up the grass near the creek. It was a show of force, and David knew it. He set down his hammer and walked toward them, his heart pounding but his jaw set. As he approached, the ATVs stopped. The riders killed their engines. Tom Crawford sat on one machine. His 2 sons, Kyle and Brett, sat on the others. All 3 of them stared at David with expressions that dared him to say something. "This is private property," David said, forcing his voice to stay calm. "You need to leave." Tom climbed off his ATV slowly, like he had all the time in the world. He was a big man, and standing this close, David was reminded of just how big. "You still going on about that?" Tom said, shaking his head. "I told you these woods been used by everyone around here forever. And I told you I own this land," David replied. "I have the deed. I have the survey. This is legally my property." Kyle, the older son, laughed. He was built like his father, thick and muscular from years of my. "New labor. You got papers saying you own it?" That's cute. We've been using this land since before you were born, city boy. Papers are what matter, David said. That's how property ownership works. Brett, the younger son, leaned forward on his handlebars. You sure you even own all this? Because from what I hear, property lines around here get pretty fuzzy. Maybe you don't own as much as you think you do. David felt a chill run down his spine. Was that a threat? Were they suggesting his deed wasn't legitimate? He'd checked everything 3 times before buying. The title was clear. But the way they said it made him doubt himself for just a moment. My property lines are clearly marked, David said. And I'm asking you one more time to leave. Tom stepped closer. Or what? You gonna call my nephew at the sheriff's office? Go ahead. See how that works out for you. He turned to his sons. Come on, boys. Let's head back. We've got work to do. They climbed back on their ATVs and started the engines. But instead of leaving the way they came, they deliberately drove in a wide circle around David, forcing him to step back. The engines roared loud enough to make his ears ring. Then they took off, leaving deep ruts in the ground and a message that was crystal clear. This was their territory, no matter what any deed said. David stood there alone, watching them disappear into the trees. His hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly, but from anger and frustration. He'd tried being reasonable. He'd tried being neighborly. Nothing worked. These people saw him as an outsider, and they were determined to make his life hell until he gave up and left. That night, alone in the cabin, David barely slept. Every sound made him jump. The wind in the trees sounded like engines. A branch scraping the window sounded like footsteps. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wondering if he was in over his head. The harassment got worse after that confrontation. Way worse. It was like David had challenged them, and now they were going to show him who was really in charge. The late-night ATV rides became regular. 2, sometimes 3 times a week, David would be woken up by engines roaring past the cabin. Sometimes they'd circle the cabin multiple times, engines revving loud enough to rattle the windows. Other times they'd shine their headlights directly into the bedroom window, flooding the room with light before racing away into the darkness. Linda stopped wanting to come to the cabin. I can't sleep there, she told David. I just lie awake waiting for them to show up. It's like psychological torture. She wasn't wrong. The random nature of it was what made it so effective. David never knew when it would happen. He'd lie in bed every night tense, waiting. Sometimes they'd come. Sometimes they wouldn't. But the anticipation was almost worse than the actual harassment. Then his mailbox got destroyed again. This time someone had used it for target practice, leaving it riddled with bullet holes and knocked off its post. David filed another police report. The same deputy showed up, took notes, and nothing happened. One morning, David arrived at the cabin to find someone had dumped a full truckload of garbage on his property. Old furniture, broken appliances, bags of rotting trash. It was scattered across the clearing in front of the cabin, like someone had backed up a truck and just unloaded everything. The smell was horrible. David spent an entire day loading it all into his truck and hauling it to the dump. It cost him $60 in dump fees, but as he worked, something caught his eye. Mixed in with the garbage were pieces of mail, junk mail, but mail nonetheless, and every piece had the same address. Tom Crawford's address. David felt his anger spike. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. They wanted him to know it was them. It was a power play, a way of showing him they could do whatever they wanted and he couldn't stop them. He took photos of the mail before throwing it away. More documentation for his growing file. The isolation was getting to him. At the general store, people literally turned their backs when he walked in. The cashier, who used to be friendly now, wouldn't even make eye contact. He overheard someone whisper, "That's the guy giving Tom trouble," as he walked past. David realized the whole town had taken sides and he wasn't on the winning side. In a small community like this, the Crawfords had deep roots. They had family, friends, history. David was just some outsider from the city who'd bought a cabin and started making demands. One evening, Linda brought up selling. They were sitting on the back porch looking out at the creek. It should have been peaceful, but David couldn't relax anymore. He was always on edge, always watching the tree line, always listening for the sound of engines. Maybe they're right, Linda said quietly. Maybe we don't belong here. We own this property, David said. We have every right to be here, but at what cost? Linda asked. Look at yourself. You're stressed all the time. You can't sleep. You're losing weight. Is it worth it? David didn't answer right away. Was it worth it? Sometimes he wasn't sure anymore. But every time he thought about giving up, about letting them win, something inside him refused. He'd worked his whole life playing by the rules. He'd done everything right, saved his money, bought the property legally, paid his taxes, respected the law, and now he was being pushed out by people who thought might made right. I can't just let them win, David finally said. If I do, what does that say? That bullies get their way as long as they're loud enough? As long as they're scary enough? Linda reached over and took his hand. Then we need to be smarter about this. Because what we're doing now isn't working. She was right. Confrontation wasn't working. Police reports weren't working. Being reasonable wasn't working. David needed a different approach. He needed to fight back, but not with fists or ATVs. He needed to fight them where they couldn't intimidate him. He needed to fight them with the law. That night, David sat down at the kitchen table with all his documentation. Every photo, every date and time he'd logged, every piece of evidence he'd collected. He spread it all out and really looked at it for the first time. This wasn't just random harassment. This was a pattern, a deliberate, systematic campaign to drive him off his property. And then something occurred to him. He pulled out his property deed and survey. He'd reviewed them before, but not carefully. Not really carefully. He started reading through the legal descriptions, matching them to his survey map. His property boundaries, the exact measurements, the landmarks used to define the edges of his land. As he read, something clicked in his mind. The creek. The survey mentioned the creek as a boundary marker. But the way it was described, his property line went further east than he'd thought. Much further. He grabbed the survey map and traced the line with his finger, his heart starting to beat faster. If he was reading this right, that meant the Crawford property bordered his, yes. But the trail they'd been using, the one they claimed was traditional access, that trail crossed his property, not just at one point, but for almost a quarter mile, and that small fishing pond they used, the one he'd seen them riding toward on their ATVs. David pulled out a magnifying glass and looked closer at the survey map. His hands were actually shaking now. Unless he was completely wrong, that fishing pond wasn't on Crawford property at all. It was on his. David couldn't sleep that night. He kept getting up to look at the survey map and property deed, checking and rechecking the boundary descriptions. By the time the sun came up, he'd convinced himself he wasn't imagining things. His property line really did extend much further east than he'd originally thought. But he needed to be absolutely sure before he did anything with this information. First thing Monday morning, he called the county assessor's office. The woman who answered sounded bored until David started asking specific questions about survey markers and legal descriptions. Then she perked up a bit. "You know what?" she said. "You should really come down here and look at the original survey documents. Sometimes the copies people get when they buy property are simplified versions." David took a personal day from work and drove to the county courthouse. The records department was in the basement, a cramped room that smelled like old paper and dust. The clerk, a woman in her 60s with reading glasses on a chain, seemed genuinely interested in helping him. She pulled out oversized books containing property surveys going back decades. "Here's yours," she said, pointing to a detailed survey from 1995, when the property was last formally surveyed. "And here's the Crawford property, surveyed in 1978. David leaned over the documents, comparing them carefully. The more he looked, the more certain he became. The creek marked the eastern boundary of his property, yes, but it curved significantly. That curve meant his land pushed further into what he'd assumed was Crawford territory. "Do you have a more recent survey for the Crawford property?" David asked. The clerk flipped through her records. "No. Looks like 1978 was the last time they had it formally done. That's not unusual out in the rural areas. People don't resurvey unless they have to." "What about the fishing pond?" David asked. "Would these documents show who owns that?" The clerk pulled out a topographical map and overlaid it with the survey documents. She used a ruler and traced lines carefully. After several minutes, she looked up at David over her glasses. "According to these surveys, that pond appears to be entirely on your property. See here? The Crawford boundary line runs south of the pond by about 50 feet. David felt his pulse quicken. "Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be looking at these documents," she said. "But if you want absolute certainty, you'd need to hire a professional surveyor to mark it out on the ground. These surveys are accurate, But nothing beats having someone actually stake out the boundaries with GPS equipment. David thanked her and left with copies of everything she'd shown him. He sat in his truck in the courthouse parking lot, his mind racing. If that pond really was on his property, that changed everything. He'd seen the Crawfords using it multiple times. They clearly considered it their pond. But legally, if the surveys were accurate, they'd been trespassing every single time. He called Linda from the parking lot and explained what he'd found. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" she finally asked. "The county records show it," David said, "but I'm going to hire a surveyor to confirm it. I need this to be rock solid before I do anything." "David, if you're right about this, the Crawfords are going to lose their minds." "I know," David said. "But Linda, don't you see? They've been bullying us, trying to push us out. And the whole time they've been trespassing on our property. They need our land to access parts of their own property. We have leverage here." Finding a surveyor turned out to be tricky. The first 3 David called were either too busy, or once he mentioned the property location, suddenly became unavailable. He got the feeling word had spread about his conflict with the Crawfords and nobody wanted to get involved. Finally, he found a surveyor from 2 counties over, a man named Robert who didn't know the area or the families involved. Robert was professional and thorough. He spent 2 full days at the property with his GPS equipment and old survey documents, placing bright orange stakes in the ground to mark the exact boundary lines. David followed him around, watching carefully. When Robert finished, he confirmed what David had suspected. "Your property line extends right to here," he said, pointing to a stake about 20 yards past where David had thought his land ended. "That trail the ATVs have been using. It cuts across your property for a 1/4 mile. And that pond? It's entirely within your boundaries. You're absolutely certain?" David asked. Robert showed him the GPS readings and the survey documents side by side. "I'd stake my professional license on it. This is your land, no question." David paid Robert his fee and asked for multiple copies of everything. Maps, measurements, photographs, GPS coordinates. He wanted documentation that would hold up in court if it came to that. That evening, David sat down with Linda and showed her everything. She studied the maps carefully, her expression growing more serious. "So what do we do with this information?" she asked. "I think we need to talk to a lawyer," David said. "A good one." Finding an attorney was even harder than finding a surveyor. The first lawyer David called took one look at the case and declined. "The Crawfords have a lot of friends around here," he said. "I'm not interested in making enemies." The second attorney said basically the same thing. Finally, David found a property rights attorney named Patricia Chen, who practiced 2 counties away. She agreed to meet with him, and David drove to her office with his folder of documentation that had grown to be several inches thick. Patricia was in her 40s, sharp-eyed, and all business. She listened without interrupting as David explained the situation, occasionally taking notes. When he finished, she leaned back in her chair and studied him. "Let me make sure I understand," she said. "You've been systematically harassed and intimidated. You've documented everything. You've now confirmed through a professional survey that the people harassing you have been trespassing on your property repeatedly, and that they require access across your land to reach parts of their own property. Is that accurate?" "Yes," David said. Patricia smiled, and it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a lawyer who'd just seen an opportunity. "Mr. Henderson, you don't have a problem. You have leverage. Serious leverage." She explained it in terms David could understand. The harassment and property damage gave him grounds to seek damages and potentially criminal charges. But more importantly, the survey gave him something the Crawfords needed. "That trail is their primary access to the back 40 acres of their property," Patricia said. "Without it, they'd have to build a new road around through their neighbor's land, assuming they could even get permission. That would cost them tens of thousands of dollars. So what do?" David asked. "We build an airtight case," Patricia said. "We document everything even more carefully. And then we file a lawsuit that will make them very, very uncomfortable." Over the next 3 weeks, David worked closely with Patricia to build their case. They organized all his documentation chronologically. Patricia hired a private investigator who confirmed the Crawfords had been selling firewood, some of which appeared to have come from David's property. The trail cameras David had installed captured clear video of the Crawfords crossing his land multiple times. Patricia also advised David to file formal criminal complaints with the state police. Bypassing the local sheriff's department entirely, 2 state troopers came out to investigate, and unlike the local deputy, they took the matter seriously. They reviewed David's evidence, took statements, and opened an official investigation. The beauty of involving the state police, Patricia explained, is that they don't care about local politics or family connections. They just care about the law. The piece that really pulled everything together was the fishing pond. Patricia discovered that Tom Crawford had been advertising fishing access to that pond on a local website, charging people $50 a day to fish there. He'd been making money off property he didn't own. That's theft, Patricia said flatly. He's been profiting from your property without permission. That strengthens our case considerably. David started to see the full picture of what had been happening. The Crawfords hadn't been harassing him just because they didn't like outsiders. They needed his property. They'd been using it freely for years, and when David showed up with legal ownership, their convenient access was threatened. So they'd tried to bully him into leaving, assuming he'd give up and sell to someone more accommodating. But they'd miscalculated. They'd assumed David was just another weekend cabin owner who'd fold under pressure. They hadn't counted on his methodical nature, his careful documentation, or his stubborn refusal to be pushed around. Patricia filed the lawsuit on a Wednesday morning. It was comprehensive, detailing every incident of harassment, every instance of trespassing, every piece of property damage. It demanded $75,000 in damages and asked for a permanent injunction preventing the Crawfords from entering David's property for any reason. The lawsuit was served to Tom Crawford on Thursday afternoon. By Friday morning, David's phone was ringing. It was a number he didn't recognize. He let it go to voicemail. The message was from Tom Crawford's voice, and it was very different from the aggressive tone he'd used before. "We need to talk," was all it said. David called Patricia. "Don't respond," she advised. "Let them sweat. Let them talk to their lawyer. Let them realize how much trouble they're actually in." That weekend, David drove up to the cabin. For the first time in months, he didn't feel anxious. He felt something else. He felt powerful. Because for the first time since this whole mess started, he wasn't the one who was scared. They were. He walked his property line, following the orange survey stakes Robert had placed. When he reached the pond, he stood there for a long moment looking at the still water. This was his, all of it, and now everyone knew it. Backed by surveys, GPS coordinates, and legal documents that couldn't be intimidated or bullied. The tables had turned. And David was just getting started. The call from Tom Crawford's attorney came on Monday morning. David was at work, sitting in his cubicle going through spreadsheets when his cell phone buzzed. The caller ID showed a local law firm. He stepped into an empty conference room before answering. "This is David," he said. "Mr. Henderson, my name is George Winters. I represent Tom Crawford and his family. I believe you know why I'm calling." David kept his voice neutral. "I might have an idea. I'd like to arrange a meeting," Winters said. His tone was professional, but David could hear the tension underneath. "My clients would like to discuss resolving this matter without going to court." "I have an attorney," David said. "All communication should go through her." There was a pause. "Of course. Could you provide her contact information?" David gave him Patricia's number and ended the call. His hand was shaking slightly as he set down the phone. This was really happening. They wanted to settle. That meant they knew they couldn't win. He called Patricia immediately. She already sounded pleased. "I was wondering when we'd hear from them. Their attorney probably took one look at our evidence and told them they didn't have a prayer." "What happens now?" David asked. "Now we wait and see what they offer," Patricia said. "But David, here's what you need to understand. We're negotiating from a position of strength. They need something from you. They need access across your property. Without it, they're landlocked on a significant portion of their land. So what do we ask for?" "Let's wait and see what they offer first," Patricia said. "Never show your cards before you have to." The waiting was harder than David expected. Every day he'd check his phone, wondering if Patricia had heard anything. He tried to focus on work, but his mind kept drifting back to the cabin, to the confrontations, to all the sleepless nights. Linda noticed his distraction. "You need to stay calm," she told him one evening. "Don't let them see you're anxious. That's what got us into trouble in the first place, remember? We let them see they were getting to us." She was right. David took a deep breath and tried to be patient. A week passed. Then 10 days. Finally, Patricia called. "They want to meet," she said. "Next Tuesday at my office. Tom Crawford, his sons, and their attorney." "Should I be worried?" David asked. "Not even a little bit," Patricia said. "Trust me, they're the ones who should be worried." The drive to Patricia's office on Tuesday felt longer than usual. Linda came with him, squeezing his hand during the quiet moments. "You've got this," she said. "Remember what they put us through. Remember those late nights, the harassment, the intimidation. They chose this path." Patricia's office was in a modern building with glass walls and uncomfortable-looking chairs. The Crawfords were already there when David and Linda arrived. Tom Crawford looked older than David remembered. His face was drawn, the aggressive confidence gone. His sons sat on either side of him, both looking uncomfortable in dress shirts and ties they clearly weren't used to wearing. George Winters, their attorney, stood and shook hands with everyone. He was a small man with gray hair and tired eyes. David got the impression he'd already had some difficult conversations with his clients. They moved into Patricia's conference room. David sat across from Tom Crawford, Linda beside him, Patricia at the head of the table. For a moment, nobody spoke. The silence was thick and uncomfortable. Finally, George Winters cleared his throat. "Thank you all for coming. I think we can all agree that this situation has gotten out of hand. My clients would like to find a way to resolve things amicably." Patricia leaned back in her chair. "I'm listening." Winters pulled out a folder. "My clients acknowledge there may have been some misunderstandings about property boundaries. They're prepared to compensate Mr. Henderson for any damages to his property. We're thinking a payment of $3,000 would be reasonable." Patricia didn't even blink. $3,000 doesn't come close to covering the documented damages. The destroyed mailbox, the property cleanup, the tree removal, the emotional distress of months of harassment. But more importantly, you're not addressing the real issue here. "Which is?" Winters asked, though David suspected he already knew. "Your clients require access across my client's property to reach a significant portion of their own land. Without that access, they'll need to build a new road through a neighbor's property, assuming they can get permission and easement rights. That would cost what, $30,000? $40,000, plus years of legal complications." Tom Crawford's face reddened. "Now hold on." Winters put a hand on his arm, silencing him. "What exactly are you proposing, Ms. Chen?" "I'm not proposing anything yet," Patricia said coolly. "I'm simply pointing out that my client holds considerable leverage here. Your clients have systematically harassed and intimidated him. They've damaged his property. They've trespassed repeatedly. They've even profited from his land by charging others to fish in a pond they don't own. The evidence is overwhelming." Kyle Crawford, the older son, leaned forward. "That pond's been in our family forever." "It's been on that property forever," Patricia interrupted. "But it's not your property." "It never was. The survey is clear. The GPS coordinates are clear. Your beliefs about traditional use don't trump legal ownership." The room went quiet again. David watched Tom Crawford's face, seeing the reality sink in. The old man looked defeated. "What do you want?" Tom finally asked, looking directly at David for the first time. David glanced at Patricia, who gave him a slight nod. "I want this to stop," David said. "I want to live on my property in peace. I want compensation for the damage you've caused, and I want it in writing that you understand where the property lines are and that you'll respect them." "That pond," Tom started. "Is mine," David said firmly, "according to every legal document that matters. You don't get to use it anymore. That's not negotiable." Brett, the younger son, shook his head. "This is ridiculous. We're talking about woods and a creek. Nobody owns nature." "Actually, that's exactly what property ownership means," Patricia said. "Your father understands that even if you don't." Tom Crawford let out a long breath. He looked at his sons, then back at David. For the first time, David saw something other than anger in the man's eyes. It might have been respect. Or maybe just resignation. "What if," Tom said slowly, "what if we offered you something more than just money?" Patricia raised an eyebrow. "I'm listening." Tom looked at his attorney, who nodded reluctantly. "I've got 5 acres that border your eastern line. It's good land, runs along the creek. What if I sold you that land at a fair price as part of this settlement? Would give you more privacy, more buffer between our properties." David felt Linda's hand find his under the table. This was unexpected. He tried to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced. "In exchange for what?" Patricia asked. A permanent easement across his property, Tom said. Not for public use, just for me and my family. Daylight hours only. No vehicles except for necessity. And we drop any claim to that pond. It's his. George Winters was writing quickly on a legal pad, nodding as his client spoke. We'd also pay for the documented damages. $5,000. And my clients would provide a written apology. Patricia looked at David and Linda, then asked for a private moment. They stepped out of the conference room and huddled in Patricia's office. It's not a bad offer, Patricia said. Those 5 acres would give you better land than what you have now. The easement is reasonable and specific. The cash payment is adequate, and you'd get it in writing that the pond is yours. What about the harassment? Linda asked. What's to stop them from starting up again? We make the easement conditional, Patricia said. Any harassment, any trespassing outside the specific easement terms, and the easement is void. That gives you the leverage to shut down their access completely if they break the agreement. David thought about it. 5 more acres of land, peace and quiet. No more harassment. Compensation for what they'd been through. And the satisfaction of knowing the Crawfords finally understood they couldn't bully him. What if we countered? David asked. What if we asked for more? Patricia smiled. What did you have in mind? They talked through the options, refined the terms, and went back into the conference room. Patricia laid out their counter-proposal. $6,000 in damages, not 5. The 5 acres at assessed value, not market value, which would save David money. The easement would be specifically limited, with strict penalties for violations, and Tom Crawford would personally sign a statement, acknowledging that he and his family had been trespassing and acknowledging David's property rights. George Winters consulted with his clients in whispered conversation. Tom Crawford looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at his attorney's face told him he didn't have much room to negotiate. Finally, Tom nodded. We have a deal, Winters said. The relief David felt was overwhelming. It was actually over. They spent the next hour working through the specific legal language, making sure every detail was clear. By the time they finished, it was late afternoon. As everyone prepared to leave, Tom Crawford approached David. His sons had already left, and the attorneys were gathering their papers. Tom extended his hand awkwardly. You're tougher than you look, he said. David shook his hand. I just wanted what was mine. Tom nodded slowly. Yeah, I suppose you did. He paused, seeming to struggle with something. For what it's worth, my boys pushed this further than I would have. Got out of hand. It wasn't quite an apology, but it was something. David accepted it with a nod. As he and Linda walked to their car, Linda squeezed his arm. You did it, she said. You actually did it. David took a deep breath of the cool evening air. Yeah, he'd done it. Not with fists or intimidation, but with patience, documentation, and the law. Sometimes he thought that's exactly how you win. The paperwork took 3 weeks to finalize. 3 weeks of lawyers reviewing documents, title companies running searches, and county offices processing forms. David checked his email obsessively, worried that somehow the deal would fall through. But Patricia assured him everything was proceeding normally. They want this done as much as you do, she said. Maybe more. Without that easement, they'd be in a terrible position. The check for $6,000 arrived first. David deposited it immediately, feeling a strange mix of satisfaction and lingering anger. The money didn't erase the months of harassment, the sleepless nights, the fear, but it was acknowledgement, proof that he'd been wronged and that wrong had been made right. The property transfer happened on a Friday. David and Linda met with the title company representative to sign the papers for the additional 5 acres. When it was done, David walked out with a new deed in his hand. His 3-acre property was now 8 acres. The creek ran through it for nearly a quarter mile. He had room to breathe, room to build, room to live without feeling like he was on top of his neighbors. That first weekend on the expanded property felt different. David and Linda drove up together, and for the first time in months, the drive felt relaxed. There was no knot of anxiety in David's stomach, no wondering what he'd find when he arrived. The orange survey stakes were still in place, marking the new boundaries. David walked the property line, Linda beside him, both of them just taking it in. The 5 acres Tom Crawford had sold them was beautiful. Mature trees, the creek bank, soft moss covering fallen logs. It was everything David had imagined when he first dreamed of owning land in the woods. You know what's funny? Linda said as they stood by the creek. If they'd just been decent to us from the start, none of this would have happened. They could have asked nicely for an easement. You probably would have said yes, David nodded. I know, but they saw me as weak. Someone they could push around. He picked up a smooth stone and tossed it into the creek. They were wrong. The easement agreement was very specific. The Crawfords could cross David's property using the established trail, but only between sunrise and sunset. No ATVs except in cases of emergency or necessary work. No guests or clients. Any violation would void the easement entirely and give David the right to block access permanently. The first time David saw Tom Crawford using the easement, it was strange. Tom drove slowly on an old pickup truck, eyes forward, not acknowledging David, who was working in his yard. David watched him pass, then return about an hour later. No problems, no conflict. Just a neighbor using a legal right-of-way. Over the following weeks, the pattern held. The Crawfords used the trail respectfully. They didn't linger. They didn't cause trouble. It was like a switch had flipped. The harassment stopped completely. David ran into Kyle at the hardware store one Saturday morning. They both reached for the same box of deck screws, hands touching awkwardly. Kyle pulled back first, his face reddening. Go ahead, he muttered. No, you take it, David said. I can grab another box. They stood there for an uncomfortable moment. Finally, Kyle said, Look, about all that stuff before. That got out of hand. David studied him. Kyle looked genuinely uncomfortable, not angry or aggressive like he'd been during the confrontations. Yeah, David said. It did. My old man told us to back off. Said you weren't going anywhere and we needed to accept it. Kyle grabbed the box of screws. Guess he was right. It wasn't a warm reconciliation. They weren't going to be friends. But it was something. An acknowledgement that the war was over and everyone could move on. The real change came at the general store. The cashier, Mrs. Peterson, actually smiled at David when he came in. Heard you worked things out with Tom, she said as she rang up his groceries. We did, David said. Good, she said, handing him his change. This town's too small for feuds. Never ends well for anybody. Other locals started nodding to him again. Not everyone was friendly, but the cold silence was gone. David got the sense that the community had been waiting to see how things played out. And now that they'd been resolved legally and peacefully, people felt they could treat him normally again. The state police investigation into the harassment moved forward despite the settlement. Patricia had advised David that the settlement covered civil matters, but the criminal complaints were separate. 2 of the charges, for vandalism and trespassing, resulted in suspended sentences and probation for Kyle and Brett. Tom Crawford received a fine and probation as well. That's important, Patricia explained. It creates a record. If anything happens again, the authorities will take it seriously. You won't be starting from zero trying to prove a pattern. David framed his original property deed and hung it in the cabin, just like he'd imagined during those dark months when he'd wondered if he'd ever feel safe there. Next to it, he hung the deed for the additional 5 acres. Looking at them gave him a deep sense of satisfaction. This land was his, legally and undeniably. He and Linda spent that summer actually enjoying the cabin for the first time. They finished the renovations David had started. New deck, updated kitchen, fresh paint inside and out. Linda planted her vegetable garden and it thrived in the rich soil near the creek. They even started using the pond, the one that had been such a point of contention. David brought up a small canoe and they'd paddle around in the evenings, watching the sunset reflect off the water. It felt like reclaiming something that had been stolen from them. One evening in late August, David and Linda were sitting on their newly finished deck when they heard an engine approaching. David tensed automatically, old reflexes kicking in, but it was just Tom Crawford in his pickup, using the easement as he was entitled to do. The truck stopped near the cabin. Tom climbed out slowly like his joints were bothering him. He walked over to the edge of the deck, staying a respectful distance away. Evening, he said. Evening, David replied, standing up. Linda stayed seated but watched carefully. Wanted to let you know I'll be bringing some equipment across tomorrow, Tom said. Got a tree that came down on my back property. Need to bring a chainsaw and the small trailer through. That's fine, David said. That's what the easement's for, Tom nodded. He seemed to be working up to something else. Also wanted to say, he finally continued, you handled this whole thing better than I did. I was stubborn, set in my ways. Thought I could make you leave. He shook his head. But you had every right to stand your ground. This is your land. I shouldn't have made you fight for it. David was surprised. This wasn't the half apology from the lawyer's office. This was genuine. I appreciate you saying that, David said. My boys learned something too, Tom added. About respecting other people's property. About following the law instead of thinking they can do whatever they want. He paused. So I guess some good came out of it even if we had to do it the hard way. The hard way seems to be the only way sometimes, David said. Tom grunted in agreement. Well, I'll be through tomorrow morning. Won't bother you. He turned to leave, then looked back. You fish much in that pond? Some, David said. It's got good bass in it. If you ever want tips on where they hide, let me know. Tom climbed back in his truck and drove away. Linda looked up at David, smiling. Did that just happen? Did Tom Crawford just offer to give you fishing advice? David laughed, feeling tension he hadn't realized he was carrying finally release. I think he did. A year after the settlement, David and Linda hosted their first real gathering at the cabin. Friends from the city came up for a weekend barbecue. David grilled burgers while Linda showed off her garden. They told the story of what had happened, though David kept it brief. The past was the past. As the sun set and their friends sat around a campfire, David walked down to the pond alone for a moment. The water was still and dark, reflecting the first stars appearing in the sky. He thought about how close he'd come to giving up, to letting fear and intimidation drive him away from something he'd worked so hard for. The key had been simple, really. Documentation, patience, using the legal system the way it was designed to be used. David wasn't a fighter, not in the traditional sense. He couldn't have intimidated the Crawfords physically. He couldn't have out-muscled them, but he'd out-documented them, out-researched them, out-lawyered them. He'd fought them with property deeds and survey maps and cameras that didn't lie. He'd fought them with the law, and the law had been on his side because he'd been right all along. He heard Linda calling him back to the campfire. As he walked back toward the cabin, he could see their friends laughing and talking. The warm glow of the fire, the cabin lights shining through the windows. This was what he'd dreamed of. This sense of peace, of belonging, of home. The Crawfords had targeted his cabin, thinking they could take it from him. Instead, David had turned the tables using the only weapons that really mattered. Truth, documentation, and ownership that no amount of intimidation could erase. He'd won not because he was stronger or meaner or more aggressive. He'd won because he was right, and he'd had the papers to prove it. Sometimes, in a world that often seemed to reward bullies, that was enough. David reached the campfire and sat down next to Linda, who handed him a beer and leaned against his shoulder. He looked around at his friends, at his property, at the life he'd fought so hard to protect. It had been worth every difficult moment. This was his land, and nothing and nobody would ever take it from him again.